Welcome to the Lynn W. Day Distinguished Lectureship in Forest and Conservation History. It's sponsored by the Forest History Society, the Duke University Department of History, and Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. My name is Jamie Lewis. I'm the staff historian at the Forest History Society. We're a nonprofit library and archive dedicated to the collection, preservation, and dissemination of the world's forest history. We're located in Durham, North Carolina. In fact, you can see behind me our brand new library. We opened last year. Unfortunately, we're closed due to current circumstances. But, when everything gets back to some semblance of normality, we would love to have you here to visit, do research, take in our new exhibit hall here again in Durham, North Carolina. So again, welcome. We greatly appreciate you watching today. At last count, more than 700 people in 17 countries had registered through Zoom for this. We're also streaming through our YouTube channel. By next Friday, you'll find this video that we're making today, or streaming today. You'll find it there. We encourage you to share it with others and to explore other lectures and videos that we've posted there. There's just a real huge wealth of material available. We're able to do this type of public programming more like it due to our member support. If you are not a member, please consider going to our website, foresthistory.org, and joining to support and helping us make more great public programming like this available. In fact, today's talk is kicking off a special lecture series we're calling the Unprecedented Seasons, and we're doing this in honor of our 75th anniversary year, which is next year. You'll be able to find more about this series on the website come early December. A little housekeeping. This lecture has been approved for 1 hour of CFE credit by the Society of American Foresters. If you are interested in getting that SAF credit, please make sure you send an email to info, I-N-F-O, at foresthistory.org, put the letters CFE in the subject line, and include your name and email address in the body of the letter. You'll have until next Friday, November 6th to do so. I have to compile all of those submissions and then send them off to the national office. I have to do so by that following Monday. So that's why it's a tight deadline. And I'll have that information again a little later. So a little further housekeeping. Our speaker today will be answering questions at the end of his presentation. The ability to pose questions is limited to those of you on Zoom. Steve will speak for about 35 minutes, and then he'll do his best to answer as many questions as possible within the time left. Please use the Q&A forum and not the chat to submit your questions. You can submit your questions during the presentation, but they will not be answered until after it ends, meaning that once Steve finishes his presentation. When submitting them, we ask that you include your name and affiliation in the question. The Lynn Day, I got to shift gears a little bit here. The Lynn Day Distinguished Lectureship in Forest and Conservation History seeks to recognize a scholar or leader in natural resources that is shaping our understanding of human history and environmental change. In addition to recognizing evolving scholarship, the lectures aim to be accessible to a broad audience on unique and provocative topics. They all consider elements of the moral challenge of living sustainably on the earth. The lectureship was first held in 1999. Our speaker today, Stephen Pyne, gave the second talk. And we felt that so much had changed and so much is at stake for all of us that we should have him back again. And so Steve is our first, I was going to say repeat offender, but but he is the first to give a lecture a second time. And I think the timing and timeliness of it will be very apparent from his talk. Steve Pyne is an emeritus professor at Arizona State University. He has published 35 books to date. I should, give it a minute, and there'll probably be another one and three more op-eds coming out by the end of his talk. He's just that prolific. But anyway, most of them deal with fire, but other topics he's tackled have been Antarctica, the Grand Canyon, and the Voyager space missions. Steve as I said, is incredibly prolific. I'm also happy to say that one of his books is in our issues series. It's called America's Fires, A Historical Context for Policy and Practice. He's a frequent contributor to our magazine, Forest History Today, and our blog, Peeling Back the Bark, both of which are available through our website. He recently completed a 10-volume survey of wildfire in the United States called To the Last Smoke, and that's published by the University of Arizona Press. His fire histories include surveys of the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe, and the planet as a whole. His knowledge of wildfire starts with his personal experience with it. Steve spent 15 years working on a fire crew in the Grand Canyon area. Steve has done more to shape our thinking and understanding of fire history and culture than any other scholar. Today, he brings a career's worth of work and thought to bear to talk about what he calls the Pyrocene, or the new age in which we live. And I'm going to let him explain that term. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Steve, and I will see you on the other end of this when we handle the Q&A. Thanks very much. Steve, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and my thanks to the Forest History Society for the opportunity to return. When I first spoke, I could reference the Great Fires of 1910, and the term megafire was on the horizon. Now, we're looking at a global fire age, perhaps a geologic epoch. So I appreciate the opportunity to update my understanding. Well, like all of us, I'm concerned about our planetary future, and I've been particularly struck by the observations of some commentators that that future is so strange and so dire that we have no narrative by which to connect it to our past, and we have no analog by which to understand it. And I object to both of those claims. As a fire historian, I think we have an extraordinary narrative. It's the saga of humanity and fire. And I think we have an apt analogy on the horizon, and that is that when you add up all of our fire practices, we are creating the fire equivalent of an ice age, or what I have taken to calling the Pyrocene. Well, let me explain how I understand this. Fire has been on Earth as long as terrestrial vegetation has, 420 million years at least. We have charcoal dating that far back, always in the context of some ecological constraints, in effect, a living landscape. 2.5 million years ago, the Earth was undergoing a cooling trend and then began to cycle in and out of ice ages, a geologic era we know as the Pleistocene. And these are some of the characteristics. Climate change was driven by the various wobbles and tweaks in the Earth's orbit, generally lumped under the term Milankovitch cycles. The features, about 80% of the Pleistocene was glacial, about 90% of the last million years. The current interglacial, if you look at the graph on the bottom, the interglacials are those light blue patches, and they have very sharp rises in CO2, and then collapse into a long series of cooling. You can see that our present era is not only longer than normal, but much deeper. And that is in effect changing the character of the geologic presence of ourselves and fire on the planet. There have been little oscillations, the Little Ice Age, for example. I'll speak very briefly about that in a minute. What were the other features? Well, you had a lot of ice-informed landscapes, continental glaciers, ice sheets. Arctic and Antarctic oceans plated over, lots of other mountain glaciers and local features, a lot of associated landscapes, outwash plains, permafrost, and so forth. This was a global shift in biogeography, of which ice was not only a major expression, but also a kind of self-reinforcing feature. Drops in sea level, waves of mass extinctions. It's also the epoch in which our ancestors arrived, the hominins. Here's a depiction of Homo erectus, who could manipulate fire, certainly used it for cooking and other purposes. And we see them bringing fuel to the fire and gathering around the fire. And that became a signature feature of the hominins. And now there's only one of us left, which means that Homo sapiens, we are not only the keeper of the flame in a biological sense, we are the Earth species monopolist over it. But all of that, all of those, that capacity we had to manipulate fire, wresting it away from nature, this wonderful painting showing it being put into a fire stick, always, it was an ability to start fires and within limits to stop them, but it depended on nature, the larger surrounding, the environments, the terrain, the wind, the fuels, the combustibles, all of these features, whether it would spread and what characteristics it might have. And we see it being used very widely, especially in places that were naturally prone to fire. People, in effect, can preempt, take over these fire regimes by substituting their burning and their patterns for what was around in nature. But there were always limits, of course. And if you wanted more firepower, you wanted to get more out of fire, you would have to manipulate the environment within which fire occurred. And for a fire historian, that signifies the onset of agriculture. We can slash and dry, we can drain wetlands, again, drying it out. We can introduce livestock. We can do all kinds of things that change the character of that living landscape, expand the seasons available for fire, change the patterning of fire on the landscape. But again, and this expanded to lots of places, even throughout Europe. Central Europe really doesn't have a natural fire regime. Fire exists because people put it in there. But it went from the tops of the Alps down to peatlands and all kinds of agricultural settings in between. It was also a great mechanism for expanding the country. Fire as a catalyst, making clearing accessible. Here's an example of Russian monks expanding that domain into Central Asia, and here the Portuguese carrying the torch to an expansion of Europe over the waters across the world and bringing their fires to interact with those that other peoples had set. There were some periods, it was not all a time of expanding fire. There were periods in which fire, indeed the entire climate, began to revert to an icy period. The Little Ice Age is the best documented example. The actual beginning point varies depending on various researchers, but say the middle of the 16th century to the middle of the 19th seems to be generally accepted. What's interesting is that in more recent years, there have been attempts to connect human demography, and not just in Europe, but globally, and subsequent land use to that change in climate. So there was a warm period. This is a graph of temperatures from central England primarily, but northern hemisphere. Known as the medieval warm period. It's a time of European land clearing and expansion. One side has said because it turned warm, this enabled Europe to expand its agricultural realm. Another side will point out that because things demographically were changing, the expansion was itself setting into motion other climate effects. In era of plague, invasion, Europe's demography shrinks, Europe's land base shrinks. As Europe expands overseas, massive demographic collapse in the Americas, the return of forests in all of these situations, all of which then leave sequestering a lot more carbon and leading to a little ice age. That in turn, by the middle of the 19th century, is giving rise to an era of clearing and really accelerated combustion. Okay, sorry for the graph. All of us get a little uneasy seeing it. And yes, these are historical coincidences. We might consider them correlations. They're not yet causes. In what ways do human land practices, especially clearing and fire assisted practices, in what ways does that interact with climate? And I think there's a good evidence that we have been affecting the climate for all of our existence throughout the Holocene. That in effect, a fire-wielding creature met a fire-receptive environment, and we have been interacting in ways that have expanded our realm and that of fire as well. But all of these occurred in living landscapes, and living landscapes come with lots of ecological checks and balances, lots of baffles and barriers. Fire is unlike other kinds of natural disasters, say hurricanes or tornadoes or floods, because it requires a living landscape to feed it. So vegetation is really the point where people, fire, and climate can particularly interact. But if you want more stuff, if you keep taking too much out of that living landscape, it will collapse and you will have to leave. But if you want more, you're going to have to find another source of stuff to burn. And we get this by going back into deep time, into the geologic history, into landscapes that were once living, have now become fossilized, or what I have come to call lithic landscapes in the form of coal, petroleum, and so forth, all these fossil biomass fuels that are now made available, and we began burning that. An enormous expansion in human firepower, and in some ways unbounded, because it transcends all of those old ecological barriers. In fact, the issue now is not finding more stuff to burn, it's what to do with all the effluent from the burning we're doing. In effect, plants like the one in the painting in the back are somewhat like factory farms for combustion. They're very efficient at extracting energy out of combustion, but they're not very good at treating all the waste that they produce, particularly the waste that's going to the atmosphere. All the old ecological and barriers and baffles that used to confine, provide some kind of containment for humanity's fires, are gone. We can burn equally day and night, winter and summer, wet or dry, it doesn't matter. So we're completely outside the realm of ecological burning that humanity had always known previously. And we can see this transition, this movement from burning the products of living landscapes, working flames, if you will, working fires, in all of the habitats that humans occupy. We can see this new wave of combustion interacting with it, mostly to replace it or where it continues to suppress it. Domestic circumstances, we don't have candles to illuminate. We don't need hearths as an entertainment center. We have virtual equivalents for it. Our cities used to burn as often as the countryside. Well, they were made of the same materials and they were subject to the same winds and droughts and ignition sources. They no longer are. Modern cities have found replacements. In many of these cases, the materials have already passed through the flames to become glass and steel and brick. But they are no longer combustible in the same way. We have taken them out of that realm. And the same is increasingly true for agriculture. Fire was fundamental to agriculture outside of floodplains. It was used often in floodplains as well to remove stubble and the rest. But fire was provided an ecological catalyst that made farming possible. And indeed, the mystery of fallow is fairly easily explained if you think about it from a fire ecology perspective, because if you need fire, and the effects of fire, then you're going to need stuff for fire to burn. And that's what fallowing did. But now, increasingly, industrial agriculture has replaced fire in all of its forms. Even that slow combustion of draft animals and the crops that they would need to feed on, which relied on fire, are now all going away. We can get fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, and treat lands with the products of industrial combustion. And this is why globally, despite all of the extraordinary outbreaks of fire we have seen and are documented so well, the amount of burning on Earth is actually contracting. And what about wildlands? Well, when people lived in more open landscapes, not cultivated in the European sense of the term, they always often used fire, and they would use fire to protect themselves against fire. They would manipulate the landscape, and they would substitute their own burning for the fires that nature provided. But wildlands, too, in industrial countries began changing. Here are some samples from the late 19th, early 20th century United States. New landscapes suddenly being opened up by steam, by the railroad, and then the lands being quickly stripped for logging or land clearing, and then burned, often unwisely, even abusively, and producing a wave of havoc. And that inspired an argument that the state would have to intervene to protect its future resources and its pioneering populations. Gave rise to a program called conservation. It was a global a global program, and distributed throughout the European Imperium and the settler societies like the US, Canada, Australia, and so forth that were offspring of that notion. It was something of an accident, but an important one, that forestry became the administrators for these lands. One of the primary projects was to set land aside so that it would be spared fire and axe, as the saying went. And foresters became responsible for that. They really weren't prepared to understand fire because forestry had grown up in Central Europe, an area that doesn't have regular cycles of wetting and drying, doesn't have dry lightning. All of its fires are socially imposed. So this created some difficulties understanding when you exported these notions to places for which fire is really fundamental and integral, which is to say most of the world. And the project was expanded, whether from the Rockies of the United States or the central provinces of India. There's a fire hilltop forester on lookout for smokes and a drum to warn the local villagers, rally them to put out the fire. The problem is that the villagers were almost certainly the ones who had set it, which segues into an observation for those fans of Rudyard Kipling who might have wondered what happens to Mowgli after he grows up. And Kipling did write a sequel, short story. And what happens is that Mowgli joins the Indian Forest Service and becomes a forest guard, one of whose primary duties is to attack jungle fires. And I like that because it shows the breadth of alarm over fire and the sense in which it needed to be contained. In the United States, the 1880 census map produced a cartography of American fire. That's what it looked like. Our first professional forester, Bernard Furneaux, dismissed the scene as one of bad habits and loose morals. Our first native-born forester, Gifford Pinchot, likened the problem of forest fires to the question of abolishing slavery. And then Pinchot in 1905, as head of the U.S. Forest Service and our national system of forest reserves, is in a position to do something about it. The big fire of 1910 offers a kind of origin story. Over 5 million acres burned throughout the West, 3.25 in the Northern Rockies. A traumatic event overwhelmed any effort to control it. gave rise to really a whole system of firefighting that is still with us in the United States, and questions what to do afterwards, how to rehabilitate the infrastructure, what to do about salvage logging, what to do about planning, and what to do with all the firefighters who had been killed. All of these issues were first addressed in 1910, and we're still living with the institutional legacies. Interestingly, there was a debate about policy at the same time, this same month, August. It became known as the light burning controversy. It boiled over in California, Northern California, exactly where the fires have been hammering the past few years. And it argued that this whole approach, looking to Europe, was misguided. Instead, we should be emulating the American Indian and routinely burning all of these forests that could support it. And this became a deep political issue. Gifford Pinchot said there's no choice. You're either with us or against us. That photo shows an actual light burn in progress. And even environmental prophets like Aldo Leopold in 1920 are arguing against light burning as a challenge to everything the Forest Service is trying to do. That controversy continued into the 1920s before being resolved in favor of suppression. And that same month, August, to sort of complete the story, one of our great philosophers, William James, published a final essay. It was called On the Moral Equivalent of War. He was alarmed at what he saw as the growing militarism in society, Western society, throughout Europe that would soon end in the trenches of World War I, and wanted to find some way to redirect all that martial enthusiasm. So he thought, there's a mechanical equivalent of heat. Why can't there be a moral equivalent of war? And so he urged a national conscription to begin a war on our common foes, that is, the forces of nature. So there it is, from firefighters, in the Northern Rockies to Harvard philosophers, a time of political activism and reform in the United States, what we call the progressive era. Put that all together, and it launches a program that is still very much with us. 3 of the next chief foresters, all the way through 1939, were all personally on the fire line. It branded this entire generation. Congress responded the next year by passing the Weeks Act, which, among other things, allowed for federal state cooperation in forestry, which would be targeted primarily at fire control, and then created a national infrastructure. The Forest Service challenged the light burners by offering what they called systematic fire protection. And not incidentally, most of that would feature machinery that could counter fires. They also offered the prospect of a science-informed program rather than something that had been based on traditional knowledge. In the 1930s, Civilian Conservation Corps and other environmental programs, putting unemployed youth to work in particular, created an infrastructure almost overnight that extended fire protection into the backcountry. And in 1934, Chief Forester Gus Silcox, who had been the number 2 man in the big blowup of 1910, promulgates what became known as the Forester's Policy, or the 10 a.m. policy, which stipulated a universal standard of control for every fire, regardless of location, by 10 o'clock the next morning. And it would seem that at the time he had the resources to do it. You've got hundreds of thousands of young men in these camps around the country, and essentially unlimited money to spend on projects, and a great bit of that went into fire control. After World War II in Korea, the U.S. has lots of military hardware left over. The CCC is gone, but we can substitute by mechanical means. These are staged photos, which also reinforce the sense that we are in a kind of war, or what I think of as a Cold War on fire. You've got the equipment, you're going to use it. Okay, so let's step back a little bit now and put this on the larger screen. Here's a graph. It only goes up to 2000. As I'm sure most of you know, these numbers accelerate as we get over the last 20 years. But this is enough, comparing essentially biomass that's burned and fossil biomass that's burned. And if we extract from that same period the statistics we have available for landscape fire in the US, that's what it looks like. So in effect, we are, in fact, substituting by technological replacement or outright suppression, extinguishing all of our fires in living landscapes to the extent possible, and replacing them with firepower generated by fossil fuels. And I invite you to think for a minute, if we took away all of those petrol-powered machines, all the helicopters and airplanes, all of the bulldozers, tractors, we took away all our fire engines, we took away our chainsaws and pumps, we took away the trucks that carry crews in, we took all of that away, what kind of fire control could we have? We would have almost none. We would have to do what people historically have always done. We would have to manipulate the environment, and then we would have to substitute our fires for nature's. In effect, for a period of time, and not just in the US, throughout the developed world, made plausible by this new power coded into machines, we could oppose nature's fires with industrial fires. By the 1960s, however, it's clear that this policy is deeply flawed. Reaction boils over. A civil society begins protesting what has become a government monopoly. Nature Conservancies conducts its first burn. Tall Timbers Research Station begins its campaign to introduce fire ecology. And by 1968, the National Park Service in the US renounced the 10 a.m. policy in favor of restoring fire. By 1978, the Forest Service had too. So we're talking about policy reforms 40 to 50 years ago that were in effect responding to the upheaval that had been set in motion by our shift in fire practices and how they affected the landscapes around them. All of this is well before climate change becomes an issue. What was replacing it? Well, prescribed fire, in effect, a kind of tamed fire. In natural or wild areas we wanted to keep wild, we would work with naturally caused fires. And even wildfires, you were given options. You didn't have to control it by 10 a.m. You could do a variety of things that would expand the ability of fire to operate ecologically on the landscape. The issue has not been one of policy, it's been one of implementation. Anyhow, all this, as I say, happens even in the absence of anthropogenic climate change. This was a time when climatologists were mostly concerned about telling us we were headed to a new ice age. Since then, climate change has become an enormous presence. It's a performance enhancer, and it's globalizing. These other conflicts occurred at a particular place. You either had one kind of fire or another. Now, places that had not converted to fossil fuels are still feeling the effects. So briefly, we have a very long history of natural fire on the land, human fire, essentially over the last 10,000 or so years, expanding that domain, recoding its patches and pulses, changing it, letting nature or lightning burn whatever humans had left untreated. And you can see I'm no graphics artist, but more recently, last couple of hundred years, we've introduced a third element, a deep time element, where we're taking stuff out of the geologic past, we're burning it in the present in ways that we don't really understand, and then releasing that effluent to the future. And the world is pretty much dividing into these two realms of combustion. This is a nice evening satellite image. You can see Europe. Not all of that is combustion, but most of it is combustion-assisted technology, even where you've got nuclear power or hydropower. And below the Sahara, Africa still dominated by burning living landscapes. And you have one or the other. There's a period of transition, but once that passes, we seem to be left with one or the other and little opportunity otherwise. And so between those two realms, what gets phased out as you make the transition is that traditional practice that humans had of burning the land, using it to make the world more habitable. And we can see some extreme realms, some extreme examples of this. Here's North Korea, conspicuous by the absence of light. But if you look at the daytime heat signatures, almost all of the hot spots, that is to say fires, are contained within that same political entity. South Korea has made the transition, North Korea has not. And we can see lots of other examples in the contemporary world, particularly where we have tried to keep landscapes in a wild or quasi-natural state. Here's a Biosphere 2 north of Tucson, Arizona, Santa Catalina's, and a full-throated wildfire, a place for which fire is inevitable, but also integral. And Biosphere 2, a model of a sustainable habitat, one that could, in theory, be plopped down on Mars, has absolutely no place for fire, zero. So we've learned, at least in the US, to tolerate fire as a natural phenomenon in wild areas, and to fear it more than ever as it moves into our built landscapes. And again, we have no middle ground here. It's missing or muddled at best. We have no middle narratives. We have no middle images, no paintings. That realm, which is up until a couple of hundred years ago defined humanity primarily, seems to be gone. So megafires have now joined our forlorn polar bear as an emblem of climate change and indeed the Anthropocene. But I would argue, as fire history suggests, it's more than climate change. We're talking about a whole fossil fuel civilization, how we get our energy, how we organize our landscapes, how we do agriculture, what kinds of ecological pathologies are introduced. We're creating novel ecosystems. In fact, from my perspective, climate history has now become a subset of fire history. We have some interesting examples of where these two realms of combustion collide. And I think power lines, it looks like the most recent fires in California, Southern California, at least one may have been started by power lines. But this is a great example of these two realms crossing and colliding with disastrous and often lethal results. And I think we can expect a lot more strange combinations as we move into the future. So we had a fire crisis before climate change became recognized. And a fire crisis is now morphing into what I think of as a fire epoch. We are, in effect, remaking the planet with the sum of our fire practices, and such that we've got too much bad fire, too little good fire, and way too much combustion overall. And we are remaking what had been an interglacial part of this cycling of ice and warm eras that characterized the Pleistocene. We're creating a Pyrocene. In this case, Milankovitch cycles are replaced by primarily fossil fuel combustion. We're seeing fire-informed biotas. We're driving at the ice everywhere. We're even going after it in permafrost now. Not necessarily that they burn every year, but they are informed by fire and fire practices, large-scale biogeographic changes underway. We can see the equivalent of sort of outwash planes, maybe these mega smoke palls, which are projecting the influence of fire far beyond the realm of flame. We're seeing a rise in sea level. We're seeing a new wave of mass extinctions. And the human relationship to fire is different. Instead of bringing more fuel to burn, here is at Fort McMurray, Canada, a few years ago, we're fleeing the wildfires that are often ill-advised combustion habits have created. So add it all up, and I think we're creating a new epoch that I like to call the Pyrocene. And in effect, it is the Anthropocene, a long Anthropocene. That is the whole of the last 10,000 years, the last interglacial, but is viewed from the perspective of fire, which is humanity's, I think, signature, unique ecological signature. So where do we go from here? What about the future? Well, I think we have two narratives. We've been living most recently a revived Promethean narrative, which is a story of fire wrested out of its natural setting, often by force, certainly by stealth, and then applied to enhance humanity's power. And we need a lot less of this. We have another narrative, the longer one that has been with us, which is as fire as a companion on our journey. Something we've always had, something we manage in effect on behalf of the rest of the living world. Our special capacity, if you will, is the keeper of the flame, and we need a lot more of this. And I think in the future, as we ratchet down our Promethean fossil fuel burning, we're going to see a dramatic ratcheting up in our more primeval burning of living landscapes. Because fire will need to be there for various reasons, and the choice is whether they are fires that we choose or whether fires that simply happen, and we deal with whatever consequences result. But whatever occurs, I often hark back to the declamation of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who declared they shall go out from one fire and another fire shall devour them. And indeed, that has been the human condition, and I think shall always be with us. So with that, I'll post a quick notice of credits and then retire for questions. Jamie?
Thanks, Steve. So we did just a reminder that you can submit questions through the Q&A forum, not through the chat. And we have several already queued up and ready to go. So I'll start with a question from Amy Christensen. And she asks, during the debate that took place between 1910 and 1920 over light burning, who was in favor of light burning? And then she has a couple more questions. Was this mostly indigenous peoples and farmers? Were there agency folks who were also supportive and saw the benefits? So I guess in a way, I think she's asking you to revisit the debate and elaborate on that.
Well, the light burning debate was the form that it took in the United States, but we can see other equivalent things wherever this sort of modern program of conservation and forestry was exported. So you can find equivalents in Canada and Australia, certainly in Africa and elsewhere. And in fact, it occurs in Europe, because it was not just indigenous knowledge that seemed to threaten the program. It was traditional knowledge. So European elites tended to treat European farmers and pastoralists who used fire with the same disdain they applied to indigenous people elsewhere. And we can find it really begins in India as early as the 1870s. Who was supporting light burning? A real grab bag of people. The state engineer of California, the US secretary of the Department of Interior actually came out in favor of light burning at that time. Several novelists and poets of the period. Lots of timber owners, lots of people who were using fire on the landscape all wanted it. They all thought that the idea of excluding fire was childish and misguided. And they predicted if we tried that policy, we will have uncontrollable fires, unhealthy forests, more outbreaks of insects. I mean, everything that's happened was forecast over a century ago. So I don't recall any indigenous people speaking. And I don't recall any ethnographers or anthropologists speaking. It was simply not a part of that subject. It's only in the last 30 years or so that anthropology has even recognized it in a serious way. There was really no science of landscape fire at the time. Foresters inherited it, weren't really well equipped to handle it, and it was decades before we began. It wasn't until the 1960s that we even have a term called fire ecology. So who was supporting all these people? But against that, you have a very coherent group that claimed they spoke with several hundred years of European science coded into forestry behind them. And they now have a political ambition. They saw themselves, if you attack them and destroy their authority on fire, then that could challenge the whole conservation project. Why should we believe them on anything else? So it gets polarized, it gets politicized, and then with unhappy but not unfamiliar consequences.
And I know that those who opposed light burning derisively called it, was it Paiute? Or
Paiute forestry.
Yeah, so they were using an indigenous term to, in effect, dismiss or minimize that notion. It also seems to me that it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those who were on the land itself, and maybe this is too deep a dive, because you have those who worked, the 1910 fires, who came out against light burning. But as that argument progresses, or the debate progresses, it was those who were still working the land or managing the land favored it, but in certain geographic regions. So that's one
it
of the
was very
things
widespread. There are accounts, Jamie, of 1904, the Plumas Boundary Survey. So this was the group that was out actually mapping what was a new forest reserve. Plumas in the area near Paradise, California, the town that burned. And they are describing, everybody out here is burning. And everybody pays no attention unless it comes directly up to, a structure or a town, then they take some action. But otherwise, and that's why the forest is open. They're not going to have large fires. And in fact, some of the researchers who were arguing against light burning published papers early in the 1920s, and they're saying, well, after we began imposing this policy, the forest began growing up. It began thickening, which the proponents loved because this was the forest of the future, but the critics hated because this is all fuel that's going to destroy everything. And so at that point, then the controversy picks up. So they recognized it, but they saw it through very different lenses.
Okay. So we have Stephen Anderson asking, with all the history and reasons for where we are today, where do you put the building of human habitat in the wildland urban interface? I think Stephen's asking you to touch on you may need to explain that term for folks outside the United States.
Well, we have this awkward term, wildland urban interface. It was coined in the mid 1980s in California to describe a problem of urban sprawl, houses going out ever further away from an urban core and coming into contact with either legal wildlands or wilderness, or what was becoming a rural landscape that was being recolonized by urban thing, which is happening throughout the industrial world. And the problem is, if these are in fire-prone places, you're going to be subject to fires. I'd like to say we could just ban. We could identify the fire equivalents of floodplains and just ban housing there, but it's not going to happen. We haven't done it in floodplains. We haven't done it in coastal plains. We haven't done it in places prone to frequent tornadoes, and on and on. So I think it's very unlikely, but we do know a great deal about why these houses burn and why communities burn. And a relatively simple suite of practices could reduce the damages. Most of these houses are being taken out by ember storms, just blizzards of sparks. They're not coming in as a tidal wave of flame. They're breaking down, it sparks. The sparks will find, you only need one spark to take if there's nobody there for a house to burn, then that house kindles others and so forth and on it goes. So it's very much a social contagion. In fact, we could easily model fire as a contagion, and in many ways, the responses to it would be the same as responding to a pandemic. That's not a model we've used, but we could. So I don't know how to do this. The problem has been in the US that we have a story that it's about dumb Westerners building houses where there are fires. And that's certainly the case. But with climate change and continued land use, we're seeing the fires going to where the houses are. So we're seeing more in the southeast. Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for heaven's sakes, burns. This changes the story.
Okay.
So I think we can harden our communities. We know how to keep these places from burning down if we choose to. We just haven't mustered the will to do it.
Okay. Timothy Inglesby, I believe it is. I apologize if I've butchered your name, Timothy. Says, given the surge of megafires in the Western United States, has the narrative of a historic fire deficit become outdated or even obsolete?
That's a great question. I think in the early 60s and 70s, when people were talking about restoring fire, there was a sense that we had a fire debt. These areas needed fire, not just to reduce fuel, but simply for ecological health and integrity. And we needed to restore that. We've been unable to do it at anything like scale, certainly in the West. So I'm not sure that that's an adequate narrative. I think it's part of a subplot that leads into the central narrative, perhaps. And what's happening in most of the Western U.S. is that fire officers are working with wildfires, and they're doing a kind of box and burn strategy. They're protecting high value places like communities and municipal watersheds, but otherwise they're willing to back off in the name of cost and safety and getting some good fire back in the landscape and allowing a lot more area to burn. So even some of these severe fires in Northern California, we're getting some preliminary burn severity maps, and maybe 10, maybe 15% are really severely burned. The rest of it's within a range of burning that looks like something we would be happy with if it were prescribed fire. This is not how we want to do prescribed fire, but if this is the only option, this is where we're going to go.
Okay. So there's kind of a related question from Chris Colvin. Chris asks, how does the history of the debate about fire management intersect with debates about wilderness preservation? And does that point toward contemporary debates and solutions to fire's impacts on human communities in the future? So again, the first part of the question is, how does the history of the debate about fire management intersect with debates about wilderness preservation? We'll let you start with that one.
Sure. Well, that can be, that can be parsed a lot of ways. One way that mattered is during the 1960s. So we have 1962, we have Tall Timbers starts these annual fire ecology conferences, hugely influential. 1963, the Leopold Report for the National Park Service argues that the Park Service should be preserving, or where necessary, recreating primitive American scenes, vignettes of primitive America. They go, 1964, the Wilderness Act comes in. So, which creates a new category of land for which, as one fire officer put it, putting out a lightning fire could be considered a criminal offense. So all of these are forcing the agencies to reconsider how they managed fire. And I think the wilderness philosophy was strong enough that it became an argument that fire is just not something that people by themselves put in, and hence intrinsically damage landscapes, but we could, by prescribed burning, distribute the goodness of the wilderness to places in need of it, so that fire could be seen as natural. And that became a very important argument. So there are bunches of ways in which the wilderness debate conflated with other arguments to create a coalition in favor of restoring fire. But restoring fire in wilderness by letting natural fire burn is very different than maintaining traditional burning in Florida on ranch lands, or cultural burning by tribal entities for their purposes. So they all had a common foe, this sort of juggernaut of suppression, but they turn out to be very different things. And that's part of why I think the fire revolution, as I think about it, as I call it, didn't get the traction it needed. It didn't have the same coherence that suppression did.
Okay. Wow, I have to say we've got a lot of questions. We've got about 20, and they're all, it's a high class problem to have. We have so many good questions, and so let me see.
Jamie, I wonder if you could muster some of them together and just send them to me, and I'll see if I can give short written answers.
We can certainly do that. What we'll do is, we'll figure out the back end of that, but meaning how to get them posted and people doing that. So along the lines maybe of the wildland urban interface and the like, Clark Seeley asks, would you speak a bit to the notion of values at risk in relation to both our history with fire and also the future outlook and conditions?
Well, we're going to have to be selective. Values at risk was a guiding principle for wildland fire up until 1935 when the 10 a.m. policy was announced. And in effect, it said values didn't matter because everything's going to be treated the same. And that was seen, it was announced as an experiment on a continental scale. It was seen as a one-time effort. We could stop fires and then we reset the clock and then we can start managing them or managing our forests better. And instead it became a kind of papal encyclical and it couldn't be, it got embedded in the culture. So I'm sorry, I'm starting to.
That's okay.
So values at risk, certainly. I mean, it's ridiculous that we're having to spend so much effort of wildland firefighting to protect communities. That's a community responsibility. We need to build up the communities. They need to be responsible for hardening their homes, developing a defensible space around their community. It is a collective project, and the wildland side can certainly contribute to this, but they are not. The problem is that you'll end up with something like CAL FIRE, which is an urban fire service out in the woods. And you try to project an urban fire model, it doesn't work. You've got to talk about land management in these more rural and wildland settings. So we need to separate those two. Let's take the urban side and treat it as urban fire. In a way, the wildland urban fire problem got misdefined. It got defined as a wildland fire problem complicated by houses. Really, it should have been defined as an urban fire problem with funny landscaping. If we had defined it as an urban fire problem up front, we would know how to solve it. And then that would free the wildland community to manage this land and fire better without having the two collide. Right now, it's sort of matter and antimatter, and we've got to disengage them.
Okay. So this will be the last question because I think it. Well, first I'll just go ahead and pose it from Mark Haynes. He puts it in the broader context of working in the woods, and he advises his forestry students, you're likely to contract a tick-borne disease, but his question that's embedded in his longer statement is, should we not make a public health argument for more prescribed fire? Which I find an intriguing, and I would bring it out of the working in the woods thing, but there's, I'll let you run with that. So again, should we make a public health argument for more prescribed fire?
Well, absolutely. And I think not just because of flame and the threat to lives from fire itself, but from smoke. And I'm really coming to think that these immense smoke palls, which have become the defining feature of fire over the last year in Australia as well as in the United States, could be the equivalent of the Dust Bowl palls, symbolizing to a very larger group than that directly affected by the flames that we have a broken system here, and it's a national issue, and we need to address it. Yes, absolutely. But I also think we've locked ourselves into a model of thinking about fire that's based on physics and chemistry. The fire is just a chemical reaction shaped by its physical surroundings. And so the appropriate response are physical countermeasures. You drop water, retardant, you scrape away all the vegetation, you throw dirt, you do various things. You treat it like a tsunami or a hurricane coming up. In fact, if we think about fire as created by the living landscape, and life creates the fuel, life created the oxygen. In the form of people, life supplies most of the ignition. Then we could think about other more biological models. And we might think about megafires as a new plague or an emergent disease coming out of our inappropriate interactions. And if that's the case, what kind of measures would we take? Would it just be calling up more engines and air tankers, or would be thinking about vaccines and quarantines? Would we be trying other kinds of measures? So that's a problem of how we define fire. And I've been a proponent for some time. I'm glad to hear somebody out there might agree that a public health model in many ways would be useful.
Okay. So with that, I'll remind our folks. Well, Steve, first of all, thank you very much for everything, for the lecture and answering those questions. A reminder, as you can see on the screen, to members of the Society of American Foresters, to receive that credit hour, you need to email us at the address info@foresthistory.org. You have until next Friday. Again, many thanks to our presenter, Steve Pyne. You can learn more about his books on fire and also what he calls the great age of exploration on his website, stephenpyne.com. That's Stephen with a PH. Pyne is spelled Pyne. You'll find his issue series book that FHS published called America's Fires on our website, foresthistory.org. We encourage you to explore the website and to consider joining the Forest History Society to help us bring more programming like this to you. Again, we're going to try and work something out where Steve answers the questions that were submitted, and you'd be able to find those responses also on our website. If you go back to the web page in a few days, I guess, promoting this lecture, we hope to have those responses there. Again, Steve, thank you so much. This lecture will be available on our YouTube channel. So it's youtube.com/forest history. It'll be posted in a few days' time. So thank you, all of you around the world. Thank you, Steve in Arizona. Thanks to the staff of the Forest History Society for managing everything on the back end and keeping everything running smoothly. And we hope to see you in the winter with our lecture series. And take care, everybody, and be safe.